Hey everybody, it's FilterSC here, and welcome back for episode number 10 of my Terran Heart of the Swarm Bronze to Master series. Episode, we're going to take a look at what I call Bandaid builds. Now, I wasn't sure what order to do these two particular episodes that I wanted to cover, but I wanted to cover, stealing and using a really good, solid, safe build that will take time to perfect, but it'll be really, really good. And while you're working on that, sometimes you have another problem with a different matchup that you're not quite ready to tackle. And in that situation, you want to use a Bandaid build, just so you can collect some points, learn a little bit about your Bandaid build, and that kind of stuff. I decided to do it with Bandaid builds first in the order, and then I'll talk a little bit more about, safe solid builds for the second episode, which will be episode number 10 of my Bronze to Master series. So with that in mind, let's dive right in and talk about what Bandaid builds are, why they're good, why you should learn them, and why they're going to help you ladder and kind of shake off some ladder anxiety. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is what is a Bandaid build. And a Bandaid build is something that you can usually apply very quickly. It's very, very easy to learn. So if you have a problem, you can maybe just see that particular build on a WCS, a GSL, Pro League. Maybe you see it in a specific matchup there. You want to go ahead and just steal that really quickly to fix a matchup you're not necessarily working on. So as a personal example, right now I'm spending a lot of time working on my TVZ. I've been watching a lot of Flash games to kind of see how he plays it out, because Flash is one of the most standard safe players out there, and he kind of relies on his mechanics to just straight up beat everybody. Now obviously my mechanics are nowhere near that of somebody like Flash, but it doesn't mean I can't try to utilize his builds and utilize his playstyle to get something that's really good, safe, standard, that's going to help me out and win a lot of games, basically against any composition my Zerg opponent throws at me, because it is such a good build. If I can outplay my opponent, I'm going to win the game. And at the same time, if I lose, I can trace it back to mechanical mistakes and problems that I had in the game, not necessarily things that my opponent did well, and definitely not a situation where my build order just got countered by something he did. Now, Bandaid builds are a little bit different. Bandaid builds don't necessarily rely that much on your mechanics, although there are definitely some out there that do. But the big thing with a Bandaid build is what it does is it gives you something that's really quick and easy to learn. It usually has a really high potential of just winning the game on kind of its first push. Sometimes it's cheesy, sometimes it's a really good draw play that sets you up with a really good economy behind it, that kind of stuff. Now getting into a little bit more detail on it, let's use an example of, let's say you're really struggling against Protoss and you just have no clue what to do in the matchup. So what you start doing is doing the old 3 barracks, you supply drop, and you pull all your SCVs and you rush the Protoss. There's really nothing you're going to gain or learn from doing that, but it's maybe a good way if you want to work on your TBT and your TBZ to quickly get through those ladder games and just flip a coin to see if you get the points or not, without really tanking your score in that particular matchup, right? It's a really good way to just quickly get through it. At the same time, there's other examples of really good Bandaid builds that will teach you how to play a longer term game. They will build up your mechanics and work on your macro a little bit, but there are some definite flaws. An example of that is something like a Widowmine drop against Protoss, right? When you do a 2-base Widowmine drop, it has the potential to just win the game instantly if they don't get detection. This definitely happened to me more than a few times, but at the same time there's a few builds out there that are really, really good against that particular build, where you're going to end up just setting yourself behind, because a lot of times what you end up with when you do a Widowmine drop is you have a really fast start port and a really fast factory, so Widowmine drop is going to be good against things like a Colossus play, but if he goes for a really heavy Archon or DT style play, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, because typically your upgrades are going to be a little bit later than his, and he's going to have some really nice timings to hit. So that's an example of kind of a longer term macro style Bandaid build, but for right now that's kind of what I'm doing, because I just want to quickly get through my TVPs while I continue to work on my TVZ, and then when I feel my TVZ is kind of up to par and I'm really happy with how I'm playing the matchup, then I'm going to go ahead and study some of the really good TVP players and try to steal a little bit of what they're doing. So again, a Bandaid build typically has a few major flaws, and it takes out a lot of the guesswork, because you're not really reacting very much to what your opponent's doing. You kind of have a game plan that you're going to execute, and you're not trying to outplay your opponent all the time, although sometimes you leave that option available to yourself, but what you're really just trying to do is get through that particular matchup as quickly as possible, and learn a little bit along the way. Sometimes it's a little bit cheesy, sometimes it's just really unsafe, sometimes it's just a few minor flaws in the build. I mean, it's something you don't necessarily want to do all the time, but that's kind of the basic idea behind a Bandaid build. So the next thing to kind of talk about is, when do you use your Bandaid build? Now, typically you would use it when you're trying to learn another matchup or maybe two other matchups. You have really specific plans for those, and you don't necessarily want to think that much about your Terran versus Protoss, or your Terran versus Terran, or your Zerg versus Protoss, or whatever it is. So all you're doing is you're just using a build order that you've seen is pretty good. You've seen it in tournaments, you know it's obviously very good. If you execute it well, it should do a lot of damage or win you the game, just on its own strengths. But at the same time, you understand there's going to be some games that you lose that are simply because you didn't make the right reads or anything like that, because you are just using a Bandaid build to try to get through a matchup. So really good times to use Bandaid builds are when you don't really want to think and learn that much within a certain matchup, and situations where maybe you've played the same matchup like 4 or 5 times in a row and you don't really want to play it again, so you just use a quick Bandaid build. It could be a cheese, it could be a longer term Bandaid, but you're just doing something that's going to hopefully get you a win without you really having to think too much about what you're doing. You're just kind of playing the game and getting through that particular game quickly. That's when you want to start using them. Now, this next part is very difficult to describe, but it is probably the most important part of this particular episode, and this is why I wanted to do it before I talked about the standard builds, because I think it's really important that you're able to identify this. And that question is, how do I know that I'm using a Bandaid build? Right? So, for example, when I was playing originally, when I first got to Masters, this is way back in like 2010, I was using a lot of like Hellion and a Banshee play before that was even popular, right? Before that was the standard. The difference was I was doing it basically off one base and taking a really late expansion, and I thought I was playing really well, and I thought I was macroing up behind it, and it turns out, realistically, I was just using a build that at the time was very, very strong, and most Zergs didn't see it very often, so they weren't very used to handling it. So I was winning a lot of games just off the fact that Zergs didn't know what they were doing against that particular build order, right? And then as I started to get higher and higher, there came a point where I'd play a Zerg that was just better than me, and I would just get crushed and just mopped up. And because I'd spent so much time relying on one particular matchup and one particular build to get me to Masters, it took me like 2 or 3 or 4 months to basically completely restructure and rebuild my own play, which is actually how this particular video series got birthed originally, because I had to go back and watch a million Day 9 dailies. I had to go back and watch Apollo's tutorials to try to figure out what I was doing wrong, and how I could better my own play so that I could continue to grow and get better on the ladder. So it's really important that you are using a Bandaid build, regardless of if it's a fast expand or it's a one-base cheese. You have to understand, is it your build that's winning the games for you, or is it your own personal skill where you're just a little bit better than your opponent? Are you making more stuff? Are you getting faster upgrades? Are you making more workers? Are you getting a faster third than your opponent? These are all things you want to look at, whereas you don't necessarily want to just be relying on your build order to win you the games, right? Because there's going to come a point where other people are just going to defend it, and you're just going to get shut down, and your own skills haven't really developed behind it, so you don't necessarily know how good you are, where you're just relying too much on a Bandaid. I'm going to give an example for this right now, and that is right now in Terran versus Terran, one of the most popular options in terms of play is the Hellbat drop, right? A lot of people do either a one-base Hellbat drop, or people are starting to do two-base Hellbat drops, and the big thing about that build is it really relies on doing damage to put you ahead, and the great thing about it is it's really difficult to defend. But you're going to hit a point where you're going to play people that are going to defend it really easily, and they're going to be in much better shape than you are, because you put all this money and stuff down a tech tree, and you don't know how to branch out and expand from that. Now, there are players that do a lot of Hellbat drops that are able to have a lot of success behind it. An example of that would be somebody like HGO Mario, who transitions into a really powerful mech play behind it. So in his case, it's not really a Bandaid build, it's just a good solid play. But when you're doing it and you're not getting all the upgrades, and you're not transitioning into a powerful mech style behind it, you're not transitioning into a really good bio play behind it, you're just kind of relying on that build to do a lot of damage or just straight up win you the game, then you're using a Bandaid build, and it's really important that you identify that it's more or less just the build you're going for that is winning you games, and when you do lose a game, it's going to feel really, really rough. So again, you really want to spend time and think about how you're playing. And if if you have certain things that are just killing you all the time, then you're probably using a Bandaid build. If I use a personal example of that, up until recently in my Terran versus Zerg, I was spending a lot of time in my own base, trying to get all my tech up, trying to build my army size up, not really putting any pressure on the Zerg or containing the Zerg at all, or forcing any units, and I was losing all the time to things like Baneling busts, Ling run bys, and roach pushes. Since then, I spent a lot of time studying my Terran versus Zerg, and I've started to develop a style where I don't lose to those things. Like, they're typically not very much of a problem anymore. Yeah, sometimes they happen, and I do lose to them because they're still good builds that the Zerg can do. But for the most part, I feel like, the wins and losses are within my control, and it's my mistakes that are costing me the games. Whereas before, there was a lot of situations where I would just die to the Baneling bust because I really didn't have any way to spot it coming, because I didn't take any map control with the build I was doing, right? And this started to apply as I got to kind of mid-masters level of play. So again, it's really important that you understand if you're just kind of band-aiding your own play, how you're band-aiding it, and if that's acceptable. Again, you can use band-aids if you're trying to fix, certain other matchups and you just want to get through some other games really quickly. But it's important that you understand that you are using a band-aid build. Now the next part of this is, where can I find band-aid builds? Like, I'm struggling in TVX matchup and I don't know what to do. One of the best places to look is just look at recent tournaments. Go ahead and look on the Team Liquid strategy section. Find out what's popular, what's flavor of the month, and see if you can apply it to your own game really, really quickly. If it's a build you can learn fast, then you've got a really good band-aid to fix a matchup while you continue to work on your quote-unquote more standard play with another matchup, right? So there's a few resources out there. If you're a big fan of tournament play, you're going to see a lot of builds out there, again without naming any names, that are basically pure band-aid builds, and rely on certain things happening within the game to work. Right? Now, obviously, these players are playing at a much higher level, so when what they're relying on doesn't work, they have a backup plan and they're prepared for it. But for you and what you're doing, you're just going to kind of try to look for the build and rip it off really quickly, and hopefully win a bunch of games with it. So again, just watch for tournament play. Look for things that are a little bit unique and out there and different that you don't see very often. Go look at the Team Liquid strategy section, see what's really popular, and try to steal that stuff. Try to use it in your own play. Now, the next thing I want to point out here is, don't get addicted to band-aid builds. If you find something that's really, really good, and it's giving you a lot of success, it feels good. It feels good to win games. But the thing you have to keep in mind is there's going to come a point where you're no longer going to be winning games essentially for free, because your opponents are just going to be good enough to stop whatever you're trying to do. A really good example of that is if you're a Zerg player and all you ever did was Baneling bust Terrans. There's going to come a point in your game where the Terrans are going to start stopping that. Whether that's all the way at the top of the Grandmaster ladder or at the top of Diamond, you're going to hit a plateau, and then when you try to overcome that plateau, you're going to find out that all of a sudden your skill in that particular matchup is actually more like a Platinum or a Gold League player or whatever the situation is, right? So it's really important that you don't get addicted to band-aid builds. They're really good and they're great temporary solutions, but at some point you have to go back and make sure you focus on that matchup and get a much more safe, solid standard play going on, so that you're going to be able to continue to have success and continue to grow on ladder. Again, it's really important that you don't get addicted to them. They are very good and they're fun to use, but just make sure that you understand that a lot of times it's somebody else's intelligence and thinking that created that build order that is winning you the games, and not your own mechanics and your own follow-through. And the last thing I'm going to mention when I start talking about band-aid builds is one of the best things you can do about them is put them in your pocket for use later. So if you've been using and you know how to do like the one base Hellbat drop really, really well, it's a really good build to put in your pocket. Maybe you get that 5th TVT in a row and you've been working on something very specific and you've been winning a lot of games, but you're just sick of Terran versus Terran because that's all you've done for the past 2 hours. You want to do something else, then go ahead and use your Hellbat drop, but understand that you're rolling the dice if that one base Hellbat drop is going to work. It's a really strong build, and you might get the win off it, but it's important to kind of learn some of them, put them in your pocket for later, so that you have a little bit of variety in your play for when you keep getting the same matchup over and over. Anyway, guys, this is Filter StarCraft. You can find me on Twitter at FilterStarcraft. You can find my stream on twitch.tv at twitch.tv/FilterSC. Hopefully you enjoyed this particular video, and definitely check out episode number 10 where I'm going to talk a little bit more about standard builds and where you can find those and why they're really good to work on, but also why they take a long time to kind of mix into your play. Anyway guys, this is FilterSC, and I will see you guys next time.